Today we're going to take a look at the life of Seneca. We're going to read the passage from the Penguin Classics version that talks about all of his life. As some of you may know, Seneca has one of the more troublesome tasks of dealing with Nero and a lot of the corruption in the Roman court. Let's take a look at it. Lucius Annius Seneca was born at Cordoba, then the leading town in Roman Spain, at about the same time as Christ. His father, Marcus Annius Seneca, was an imperial procurator who became an authority on rhetoric, the art of public speaking and debate. He was the father not only of our Seneca, who speaks of his old-fashioned strictness, but also Novatus, later known as Gallio, the governor of Achaia, who declined to exercise jurisdiction over St. Paul, and of Mela, less ambitious than his brothers, but an able financier, and father of the brilliant young poet Lucian. Seneca suffered severely from ill health, particularly asthma, throughout his life. He tells us that at one time the only thing which held him back from committing suicide was the thought of his father's inability to bear the loss. He spent a period of his life in Egypt, where the husband of a devout aunt named Marcia was the viceroy of the emperor Tiberius from AD 16 to 31, there acquiring experience in matters of administration and finance. He also studied in geography and ethnology of Egypt and India, and developed a lasting interest in natural science, speculative rather than empirical, although Pliny speaks of him as the authority on geology, marine life, and meteorology, and others have admired his remarks on, for example, evolution or the explanation of rings around the sun. His interest was drawn at an early age to Pythagorean mysticism and various cults of Eastern origin, then gaining adherents in Rome, before his final acceptance in large part of the Stoic philosophy. After training for the bar, he took successfully to the public life, becoming quaestor in spite of the handicaps of his health, his foreign background, and comparative lack of family or other connections. When Caligula succeeded Tiberius in AD 37, Seneca had become a leading speaker in the Senate, and so aroused the jealousy of new emperor that according to Dio Cassius, he ordered his execution and was only induced to let him off by a woman close to the imperial throne who said that Seneca was suffering from advanced tuberculosis and would not be long before he died. This incident apparently resulted in his temporary retirement from public affairs. In AD 41, in the first year of the reign of Caligula's successor, Claudius, Seneca again came under sentence of death, commuted to banishment, for reasons which we do not know. The pretext was adultery with Julia Livilia, the late emperor's sister. The more likely explanation is the new ruler's consort, the notorious Messalina, considered him dangerous. His exile on the island of Corsica does not seem to have been endured as stoically as it might have been. The encouraging spirit of an essay of consolation sent to his dearly loved mother Helvia is entirely absent in another addressed to Polybius, an ex-slave who had become a trusted servant to the emperor, which contains some abject flattery and was probably never meant to be published. He had by now suffered the loss not only of his father but of a son, and his first wife died while he was away. The only solace for him in these 8 long years of loneliness and near despair was the reception given to the poems, tragedies, and essays to friends which he continued composing during his banishment. His fortunes turned dramatically in AD 49. Messalina had been executed, and the emperor's new wife, Agrippina, had Seneca recalled to Rome, appointed to the high office of praetor, and made tutor to her 12-year-old son, Lucius Domitius Anabarbus, the boy who was shortly to become the emperor, Nero. Agrippina's motives, according to Tacitus, apart from the instruction of her son, were confidence that because of his literary fame, the move would gain them popularity, and a belief that he would prove a reliable ally and a useful advisor to herself and Nero in their plans for the future power. There is no evidence that Seneca was connected in the poisoning of Claudius in AD 54, but he wrote the speeches in which the 17-year-old Nero delivered after his accession, and was probably the author of a witty, if to us a little tasteless, attack on the dead ruler's memory. The apocolosynthesis, or pumpkinification, an imaginary tale of the rebuffs received by the recently deceased emperor when he presents himself at the portals of heaven, and his application for admission is debated by the gods. Nero did make a formal speech in honor of his predecessor, which was said to display a great deal of polish and to be a good example of Seneca's attractive style, will turn to the ears of his time. The new regime opened well, and Nero's first 5 years were spoken of as a period of unequaled good government, and Emperor Trajan even calling them the finest period in the history of Imperial Rome. For this Rome was indebted to Seneca and an army officer named Burrus. These two, the most influential as well as the most enlightened of the men who surrounded Nero, whose wide experience was common knowledge, prevented the hot-headed young man from carrying out a lot of murders on his accession and aimed at channeling some of his energies into permissible pleasures. Only briefly alarmed by the poisoning of Britannicus and acting throughout in complete harmony, they succeeded in keeping public business out of Agrippina's hands and their own. Tacitus ascribes the secret to the influence of Seneca, to his tuition of Nero in public speaking, and his engaging manners and high principles. That of Burrus to his military responsibilities and austerity of character. The two of them took over total power and exercised it to the utmost of their ability in the best and justest way conceivable, thus each alike arousing all men's approval. While Nero amused himself, they set about problems of government. We notice, to give instances, their activity, legal and financial reforms, including the reduction of indirect taxation and steps to prevent peculation and extortion by provincial governors, and the persecution of a successful war in Armenia to settle the empire's eastern frontier. Seneca's geographical interests appear in dispatch of an expedition to investigate the source of the Nile. Yet another of his interests was shorthand, the Roman system of which he is said to have completely revised. Neither he nor Burrus appeared to have held any stand in legal or constitutional office that could have said to have given them the authority they wield during these years. Seneca, the real master of the world, seems simply to have been the moving force behind the throne. It is probably safe to say that Nero, unlike Aristotle's celebrated pupil at a similar age, Alexander the Great, was still under the influence of a teacher of undoubted personal charm, and was quite content to leave him to the direction of affairs in which he had little to real interest. Once the young emperor began to listen to other advisors, and increasingly to indulge in his more violent and vindictive impulses, this happy situation was doomed. In AD 58, Seneca was being attacked by people like Publius Sullius Rufus. Accusations seem to have ranged in gravity, from sleeping with the emperor's mother. Obviously, the man had failed to learn his lesson from his thoroughly deserved banishment for seducing imperial princesses, and the introduction of the emperor to pederasty, to the uselessness of his studies and the effectiveness of his oratorical style. But the campaign against him generally centered on the apparent contrast. It has been a stock criticism of Seneca right down the centuries, between his philosophical teachings and his practice. Instances of hypocrisy, according to Sullius, were the philosopher's denunciations of tyranny, which did not stop him from being tutor to a tyrant, of flattery, ill according with the attitude he adopted, especially from Exile, towards ex-slaves who heeded departments in Claudius's administration, of extravagance in spite of allegedly giving banquets served at 500 identical tables of citrus wood with ivory legs, and above all, of wealth. What kind of wisdom, asked Sullius? What philosophical teachings? had led him to acquire 300 million sesterces within the space of 4 years in royal favor. The childless and their legacies had been, if the might so put it, enticed into Seneca's net, whilst all Italy and the provinces were being sucked dry by his practice of lending money at unlimited rates of interest. Seneca was indeed already celebrated for his riches. Juvenal mentions the great gardens of the immensely wealthy Seneca. Agrippina, says Dio, that acquired for him untold wealth from all sources. The agricultural writer Columella mentions the remarkable productivity of his wine-grown estates, the best in Italy, at Mentana. The reply, if any, which Seneca gave to his attackers' criticisms of his wealth was probably that contained on the essay on the happy life sent to his brother Gallio. What counts, he says, is one's attitude to wealth, which is the wise man's servant and the fool's master. He, like any good Stoic, could lose all he had any moment without being a whit less happy. This is the core of a long reply to the charge, which the states with complete frankness that philosophers do not practice what they preach. His everyday life did not lend countenance to such attacks. We have at least his own accounts of his plain diet and lifelong teetotalism, his hard bed, cold baths, and daily runs. And on this occasion he came to no harm from his enemies. In AD 59, Nero had his mother put to death, the murder being carried out in cold blood after a calamitous failure of an attempt to stage an accident at sea. There is no reason to believe that Seneca and Burrus had no knowledge or part in the planning of this crime, but as the facts became known, did their best to lessen its impact on public opinion. Seneca certainly drafted the letter sent to the Senate, explaining how her death was the result of the exposure of a dangerous plot of hers against the emperor's life. Dio would have us believe that Seneca averted a general massacre by saying to Nero, "However many people you slaughter, you cannot kill your successor." Tacitus tells us that the death, probably murder, of Burrus in AD 62 broke Seneca's power. Enemies gained the ear of Nero with tales of Seneca's popularity and growing wealth. The first was represented as being dangerous to the throne, the second as overshadowing the possessions of the emperor himself, whose abilities as an artist and speaker were also, it was said, being disparaged by his old instructor. Nero, they said, was now grown up and it was time for him to shake off his tutor. Seneca, warned of this by friends, realized his danger and decided to ask the emperor for permission to retire public life. The request was eventually granted, and the pardon was made amicable. For the last year or so of his life, Seneca devoted himself to philosophy and writing, including the Epistulae Morales to Lucilius Jr., a native of Pompeii, a hard-working higher civil servant, procurator in Sicily at the time, who appears to have dabbled in literature and philosophy. Spending his time moving around southern Italy with Paulina, his second wife, Seneca now rarely visited Rome, and even to disarm suspicion for greater safety, gave, says Dio, his entire fortune to the emperor. Tacitus mentions a story of an attempt on his life by poisoning, averted either because a slave gave the plot away or because the philosopher was, in fear of just an attack, living on an extremely simple diet of fruits grown wild and running water. Then, in AD 65, came the disastrous conspiracy against the emperor by Piso and others, quite possibly including Seneca. There was a report of a sub-conspiracy to kill Piso as well and make Seneca emperor, being a man who seemed to be marked out for supreme power by the good qualities for which he was so famous. Many people lost their lives on the discovery of the plot. Seneca, like many others, was asked to commit suicide, the then prevailed method of imperial execution. Tacitus, described of this death, is not quickly forgotten. His brothers and Lucian followed him, all by their own hands, in the course of Nero's frenzied purge of enemies, real and imagined. According to some, a true Stoic, like Cato under the Republic, could have stayed on in political life to the bitter end. But after the loss of his influence over Nero, the Spaniard could hardly have hoped to be of any useful service any longer to the Roman world. And in an age in which many lived in a recurrent dread of a capricious emperor's messages demanding, obliquing or otherwise, the recipient's suicide, the alternative to this retirement was undoubtedly death. Certain other Stoics, indeed, stood up to the emperors and were rewarded for their opposition to misrule with martyrdom. Seneca chose to spend what time was left to him in philosophy, and the reader may be left to decide, in fairness not forgetting his chronic ill health, whether his lack of moral courage outside the study and his earlier events detracts from his achievements. Surprisingly, perhaps, the satirist of the century, Juvenal, does not pick on the difference between this public figure's conduct and his philosophical professions, of which a variety of later writers have made play. "Sir, are you so grossly ignorant of human nature," asked Dr. Johnson, "as not to know that a man may be very sincere in good principles without having good practice?" Seneca, all the same, may well be history's most notable example of a man who failed to live up to his principles. This does not prevent him from being the outstanding figure of his age. Seneca, in those days, unsurpassed both in the field of letters and in power which afterwards grew too great and recoiled upon his own head, was the last man to be impressed by things which did not count, said his contemporary Pliny. Money, power of achievements in public life or letters are, despite the interest of the little we know of his career, not the things which Seneca would want to be connected by people coming across his name today. That he did not expect to be forgotten we know. In one letter he actually promises Lucilius immortality through having corresponded with him. But what he would have liked to be remembered for would have been the value of the ideas which, so he tells Lucilius in his 8th letter, he was committed to writing in the hope that he might be of use to later generations. And if you like that video, then you can check out my book where I talk about that and many other issues that might help you. It's got a title so edgy, I'm not even sure if I can say it on YouTube. So check it out in the description. And as always, if you want, you can like, subscribe, and all that other fun stuff. More videos coming, of course.